Within Wealth of Nations, Book 2, Chapter 2, of Money, Adam Smith wrote, "The amount of the metal pieces which are annually paid to an individual is often precisely equal to his revenue, and is upon that account the shortest and best expression of its value." End quote. He is saying that a person who receives hand-to-mouth wages spends all his money upon the necessaries of living, and this money forms part of the stock reserved for his immediate consumption. Adam Smith said, "The amount of the metal pieces which are annually paid to an individual is often precisely equal to his revenue, i.e., his wages pay exclusively for his stock reserved for his immediate consumption, and afford nothing more, no savings nor investments. His wages may be inadequate to supply his wants and pleasures, but what he spends his wages upon is compounded of its substance and its form, of the materials and the manufacture." This assumes that the person who receives these wages does not own an enterprise which makes profit, and so these wages are the shortest and best expression of value, as Smith points out, within the case where the worker who receives wages does not own a business. Smith continued, "But the amount of the metal pieces which circulate in a society can never be equal to the revenue of all its members." End quote. Recall that revenue is measurable only in material, tangible, actual stuff. Smith is saying there is more stuff in circulation in a society than exists money which pays for it. Smith continued, "As the same guinea which pays the weekly pension of one man today may pay that of another tomorrow, and that of a third the day thereafter, the amount of the metal pieces which annually circulate in any country must always be of much less value than the whole money pensions annually paid with them. But the power of purchasing, or the goods which can successively be bought with the whole of those money pensions, as they are successively paid, must always be precisely of the same value with those pensions, as must likewise be the revenue of the different persons to whom they are paid. End quote. Smith is saying that money is the great wheel of circulation, the great instrument of commerce, which affords the pensioner his pension. And when the pensioner spends his pension, the money he spends, he receives in return for it the whole value of whatever goods, services, commodities, or so forth that he spends it upon. The money passes into somebody else's hands. The retailer who sold him these goods or commodities. Smith continued, that revenue, end quote, the power of purchasing, or the goods which can be successively bought with the whole of those money pensions, quote, therefore cannot consist in those metal pieces, of which the amount is so much inferior to its value, but in the power of purchasing, in the goods which can successively be bought with them as they circulate from hand to hand. End quote. Within the same section, Smith said, what is the proportion which the circulating money of any country bears to the whole value of the annual produce circulated by means of it? It is perhaps impossible to determine. It has been computed by different authors at a fifth, at a tenth, at a 20th, and at a 30th part of that value. End quote. Begin paraphrase. But how small soever the proportion which the circulating money may bear to the whole value of the annual produce, as but a part, and frequently but a small part of that produce, is ever destined for the maintenance of industry, the amount of circulating money of the country must always bear a very considerable proportion to that part of the annual produce which is destined for the maintenance of industry. End paraphrase. Smith is inferring that most which is produced becomes consumed, and by doing so, this can only happen if circulating capital is maintained. Recall that circulating capital consists of 1. Provisions, 2. Materials, 3. Finished goods, and 4. Money. where the provisions may be consumed in the sense that fuel is consumed, or may be constructed or bought in the sense that a factory is constructed and its machinery is bought or maintained. Produce is real, tangible stuff. The annual produce is how much stuff is produced within a nation. Part of this stuff is sold for money, which is then used to maintain industry, replenish provisions, buy fuel for the factory, maintain the machinery, fix the factory's roof, and acquire more materials for the factory to work upon, pay the workers' wages, all of which hopefully creates finished goods. But it is a small part of the annual produce which is used to maintain industry. And as the circulating money bears a small proportion to this annual produce, it, however, bears a very significant proportion to the circulating capital which is destined for the maintenance of that industry which produces the annual produce. Smith said, though the weekly or yearly revenue of all the inhabitants of any country in the same manner may be, and in reality frequently is, paid to them in money, their real riches, however, the real weekly or yearly revenue of all of them taken together, must always be great or small in proportion to the quantity of consumable goods which they can all of them purchase with this money. The whole revenue of all of them taken together is evidently not equal to both the money and the consumable goods, but only to one or other of those two values, and to the latter more properly than to the former. End quote. Smith is saying that the value of the consumable goods, where the value is the substance and form of the materials and the manufacture, is much more representative of the total amount of stuff which is produced within a society than money is representative of the total amount of goods which is produced within a society. I now paraphrase from the second last paragraph in Book 2, Chapter 2 of Money. The proportion between the exchangeable worth of gold and silver and that of goods of any other kind depends upon the proportion between the quantity of labour which is necessary in order to bring a certain quantity of gold and silver to market, and that which is necessary in order to bring thither a certain quantity of any other sort of goods. The proportion between the exchangeable worth of gold and silver and that of goods of any other kind depends upon the richness or poverty of the mines, which happen at any particular time to supply the great market of the commercial world with those metals. End paraphrase. Earlier within the same chapter, Smith said, the whole capital of the undertaker of every work is necessarily divided between his fixed and his circulating capital, while his whole capital remains the same. The smaller the one part, the greater must necessarily be the other. End quote. Note that Adam Smith had never seen a combine harvester, and so he excludes fixed capital from the set as provisions of an enterprise. I don't do this. I say that replenishable provisions, such as fuel for the combine harvester, form a different subset than fixed capital as provisions, which is also a subset of provisions. We can infer that Smith is correct when he says the more capital becomes invested in any particular moment in fixed provisions, the less there will be for replenishable provisions and materials within any given enterprise at a particular moment in time. If a farmer buys a tractor, the expense of paying for this tractor may reduce the amount of replenishable provisions and materials he can afford to buy at that time. Likewise, if a factory owner buys more machinery, then the expense of paying for this new machinery may reduce the amount of raw materials as circulating stock he can afford to purchase. In the alternative direction, if a biscuit factory owner buys more flour, the owner may have less money to buy new ovens. Adam Smith continued, it is the circulating capital which furnishes the materials and wages of labour and puts industry into motion." End quote. Adam Smith can present his material quite cryptically sometimes. He is saying that the finished work being sold via trade and transportation will facilitate a given enterprise which is selling these finished work profitably to replenish the materials that this enterprise initially bought, which was necessary for the finished work. In turn, this finished work becomes sold and distributed, and the cycle repeats itself. Smith continued, "Every saving, therefore, in the expense of maintaining the fixed capital, which does not diminish the productive powers of labour, must increase the fund which puts industry into motion, and consequently the annual produce of land and labour, the real revenue of every society." So, if a farmer buys an equally good tractor for a cheaper price, or even a better tractor for the same price, or even a better tractor for a cheaper price, he can now afford to acquire more stock, where his tractor is being treated as fixed capital and stock, say, as materials, cattle, and other forms of provisions. The farmer will now be able to buy more material upon which to work. Say, if a leather worker buys a machine of the same quality but a cheaper price, she will now be able to buy more materials to work upon. This stock in turn employs people, and as the consequences of this stock, i.e. the finished product, is exchanged by money, and the stock, provisions and materials is bought by money, we can observe as a postulate that money always gravitates toward the location of where the stock is. Most modern economists disbelieve this postulate. They believe that industry gravitates toward where money is, but they are all wrong.